My grandmother's hand smelled like rosewater and cedar. That's the first thing I think about now when I try to hold on to her. Rosewater and cedar, and the way she'd fold the tissue paper back over that dress like she was tucking in something alive. She told me it would be mine. She said it sitting in her sewing room in rural western Pennsylvania, in the house on Morrow Creek Road where the floorboards creaked in the same 3 spots for 40 years, and she looked at me the way she never looked at anyone else and said, "Nora, this dress is yours when the time comes." I was 19. I didn't have a boyfriend. I didn't have much of anything except her, and that was enough. She died 2 years later. The dress disappeared 3 weeks after the funeral, and my mother told me, straight to my face, without a single flicker of anything behind her eyes, that it had been lost in the move. I smiled. I said, "Oh, that's such a shame." What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that 6 years before that moment, the summer I turned 22, I had already prepared for exactly this. Welcome back to Revision Stories, where secrets come out, betrayals get exposed, and the people who thought they'd get away with it never do. If you're new here, subscribe. Join the family. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Drop a comment where you are listening from. It means a lot to me. Now let's go. My name is Nora. I am 37 years old. I work as a records administrator for a county courthouse in western Pennsylvania, and I have spent the better part of my adult life being the kind of person people underestimate on sight. That part, at least, turned out to be useful. My mother's name is Diane. She remarried when I was 14, a man named Gerald, who came with a daughter named Bryn, who was 12 at the time and who my mother immediately decided was the daughter she had always actually wanted. That is not self-pity speaking. That is simply the architecture of what our household became. Bryn was pretty and easy and performed her emotions loudly in ways that my mother responded to. I was quiet. I read too much. I did my homework at the kitchen table with calloused hands that I'd gotten from helping my grandmother in her garden every summer, and my mother would walk past me on the way to the refrigerator without saying anything. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this so you understand the terrain. My grandmother, my mother's mother, which always struck me as one of the great ironies of our family, never cared for Diane's choices much. She was a woman named Ruth Elaine Marsh who had grown up dirt poor in Venango County, who had survived a first husband and outlived a second, who had made her own wedding dress by hand in 1961 from 12 yards of silk charmeuse she'd saved for over 18 months. Every penny of it earned, every stitch of it deliberate. The dress was extraordinary. Even I, who knew nothing about fashion at 19, could see that it was extraordinary. It had a long, clean silhouette, hand-sewn seed pearls across the bodice, and a chapel-length train that she had somehow kept in almost perfect condition for over 4 decades. She kept it in an archival box with acid-free tissue and cedar blocks, and she aired it once a year every August. And she told me it was mine. She told me that clearly, explicitly, more than once. She told my cousin Patricia. She told her neighbor Helen Szymanski, who had known her for 30 years and who would later become one of the more important people in this story. She even wrote it down in a letter once, not a legal document, nothing with a notary seal, just a handwritten letter that she put in an envelope and kept in her Bible, which is exactly where it was when she died, and exactly where it stopped being shortly afterward. The thing about my grandmother's death is that my mother was the one who handled the estate. Ruth died without a formal will beyond a few handwritten pages that a county attorney in Venango County had helped her draft, but that had never been properly executed. They were found, but they were unsigned, which meant they carried no legal weight for purposes of probate. What that meant practically was that my mother, as Ruth's surviving child, became the administrator of her estate. My Uncle Dale had died in 2009. There were no other children, so Diane had full authority, and Diane exercised it. I was not at home when the estate was cleared. I was living in an apartment in Butler County at the time, working my second year at the courthouse, commuting 40 minutes each way and eating dinner most nights standing at the kitchen counter because I only had one chair and it was stacked with folders. I drove to Morrow Creek Road twice during the estate process, and both times my mother was there with Gerald, moving things methodically, and the atmosphere was one of controlled efficiency that did not particularly invite input. I asked about the dress on my second visit. My mother was wrapping dishes in newspaper at the kitchen table. She didn't look up. She said it had been lost in the move. She said she thought it had gotten mixed in with things that went to donation by mistake, or possibly it had been damaged and discarded before she'd gotten there. She wasn't sure. She used a gentle, regretful tone, The kind of tone you use when you're describing something that was tragic but is now, unfortunately, simply over. I said, "Oh, that's such a shame. I had been expecting this for 6 years. Not specifically this, not the exact words or the exact expression on her face, but the shape of it. I had been expecting the shape of this for 6 years. Here is what I had done when I was 22. That August, the last August before my grandmother got sick, I had come to Morrow Creek Road for my usual 2-week summer visit. Ruth and I did our ritual. We aired the dress, we inspected it, we refolded it with fresh tissue. She held it up against the window light and showed me again where she'd re-sewn the right shoulder seam in 1978 and how you could barely tell. And then she said again what she always said, "This is yours, Nora, when the time comes." I had been in my grandmother's sewing room 100 times. I knew where she kept her embroidery scissors, her seam ripper, her collection of antique buttons in a mason jar, and I knew, because I had thought about this carefully and with a kind of cold clarity that probably should have alarmed me more than it did at 22, that my mother was not a person who kept promises that cost her something. So before we refolded the dress that August, while my grandmother was in the kitchen making tea, I carefully took the inner hem of the chapel train, the deepest interior fold, the part that would never be seen, the part that no seamstress would ever touch without intention, and I opened 3 stitches with a seam ripper. Just 3, along the fold line. I had prepared a small piece of the dress's original silk lining fabric that I'd saved from a repair Ruth had done 2 years prior, when a small section of the interior had frayed. Ruth had given me the scrap herself, just to have. I had kept it. I pressed it flat, wrapped it in a clean piece of acid-free tissue paper, and I wrote a note. The note read, "This piece of the original interior lining of the Marsh wedding dress, 1961, is included here as proof of authenticity and provenance. This dress was promised to Nora Jean Calloway, granddaughter of Ruth Elaine Marsh, on multiple occasions and in the accompanying letter, Nora Calloway, August 14th. And I included the year. I also included, folded within the tissue, a photocopy of a letter. Not Ruth's original letter from the Bible. I didn't take that. But I had photographed it with a disposable camera the summer before, had the film developed at the drugstore in Oil City, and had kept 1 copy in my apartment and put 1 copy, this one, inside the folded tissue with the note. Then I restitched the 3 stitches, by hand, using a needle and thread I'd matched from Ruth's own collection so the color was exact. The seam was invisible, the repair was invisible, the contents were invisible. I refolded the dress, and I laid it back in the box, and I carried my tea out to the porch and sat with my grandmother and listened to her talk about her garden. I never told her what I'd done, not because I was ashamed of it, but because it would have broken her heart to know I thought it was necessary. It was necessary. 2 years later, she was gone. The dress disappeared, and I smiled and said, "Oh, that's such a shame." Here's the next part. Bryn announced her engagement in February. She was marrying a man named Todd, who worked in insurance and who had once, at a family Christmas dinner, explained to me how county records administration was probably going to be automated in the next decade in a way that suggested he found this personally satisfying. They were getting married in September at a restored barn venue outside Meadville, Crawford County, which I know because my mother emailed me the save the date with a note that said she hoped I could make it. The dress entered the picture in April. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon. She was in high spirits. She said that she had found something extraordinary while going through some things, and that she had decided to give Bryn a very special gift for the wedding. She said she hoped I would be happy about it. She said that Ruth's dress had actually turned up. It had been stored in a box at Gerald's sister Carol's house, apparently mixed up during the estate move, and that she had decided it was a perfect opportunity to give Bryn something with real family history. She said Ruth would have wanted Bryn to feel included in the family. I was sitting at my kitchen table when she said that. I had a cup of coffee in front of me, and I remember looking at it while she spoke, watching the surface of it, completely still. "That's wonderful," I said. "Bryn is going to love that." I hung up and I sat there for a long time. There is a particular kind of fury that has nowhere to go, and it is the quietest kind. It does not throw things. It does not raise its voice. It sits at a kitchen table in a small apartment in Butler County, and it looks at a cup of coffee, and it breathes slowly, and it remembers that it has been ready for this moment for 15 years. I called my cousin Patricia that evening. Patricia is 2 years older than me. She had known Ruth her whole life. She had heard Ruth say the dress was Nora's more than once. Patricia's reaction was immediate and specifically profane, in the way that only someone from Western Pennsylvania can be when they are truly offended, and she said she would help me with whatever I needed. I also called Helen Szymanski, my grandmother's neighbor from Morrow Creek Road. Helen was 74 and had the memory of a court reporter and the disposition of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to say something on record for years. She said she remembered Ruth's exact words on more than one occasion. She said she would put it in writing. She did. Then I called an attorney, not a stranger, a woman named Gretchen Farwell, who I had known through the courthouse for years and who practiced estate and property law out of an office in Cranberry Township. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, which is how you know an attorney is actually listening. Then she said, "You have the note inside the dress. You have the photograph of the original letter. You have 2 witnesses who will attest to Ruth's stated intent, and you have the defendant planning to use the property publicly at a documented event." She said, "I want to be there." We talked about options. We talked about a pre-event legal letter demanding the dress not be used or transferred. We talked about filing a civil claim. We talked about what was admissible and what was not. Gretchen was methodical and clear-eyed, and she had that particular quality of a good lawyer, which is that she makes the chaos feel mappable. But here is what I told her, and this is the part that made Gretchen pause. I said I didn't want to file before the wedding. I said I wanted to go to the wedding. I wanted to sit in a chair at a restored barn in Crawford County in the one decent dress I owned, which I had ironed twice the morning before, and I wanted to wait. I wanted to see my stepsister walk down the aisle in my grandmother's dress, and I wanted to wait until the reception. I wanted to let Bryn have her ceremony. I wanted to wait until Bryn was standing in that reception hall with her new husband and her wedding photographs being taken and her family gathered around, and I wanted to wait until the moment my mother looked most comfortable, most satisfied, most certain that she had arranged the world exactly as she intended. And then I wanted to stand up. Gretchen said, "You know, most clients want resolution before the event." I said I knew that. She said, "You've thought about this for a long time." I said I had. She said, "Bring the seam ripper." Patricia drove with me to Meadville in September. We left Butler County at 7 in the morning, stopped once for gas and coffee at a station outside Mercer, and mostly drove in silence. I had a small bag with me. In the bag was a seam ripper, a pair of embroidery scissors, a fresh pair of clean cotton gloves, and a copy of Gretchen's legal documentation affirming my claim, including the sworn statements from Patricia and Helen and the copy I had made of my photograph of Ruth's letter. Gretchen had also filed notice with a magistrate in Crawford County the previous week as a precautionary measure, establishing that a dispute over the dress existed prior to its use in a wedding ceremony, which protected the chain of custody argument if anything went to civil court. I also had, in my coat pocket, the original photograph from the drugstore in Oil City. I'd kept it for 15 years. I'd moved it through 3 apartments. The edges were soft from handling, but the image was clear. Ruth's letter, in her handwriting, on the lined notebook paper she used for everything. My name, right there on the page. We got to the venue at 10:15. It was a beautiful property, old stone foundation barn, restored interior with exposed beams and white-painted shiplap and glass pendant lights. The kind of place that costs a real amount of money and wants you to know it. My mother was already there. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, and she had her hair done, and she hugged me at the door with genuine warmth, which is something she has always been able to do without difficulty. She hugged Patricia too, slightly less warmly, and said how wonderful it was that we'd made the trip. Bryn came through at one point before the ceremony in a white robe, with her bridesmaids clustering around her. She looked genuinely happy. I want to be honest about that. She was not a villain in that moment. She was a woman on her wedding day who believed she was wearing a beloved family heirloom that had been given to her as a gift. That is what she believed. That was not her fault. The ceremony was beautiful. The dress was extraordinary. Even from my seat in the 3rd row, I could see the seed pearls on the bodice, the fall of the silk turmouse that had survived 60 years better than almost anything else in my family had. My grandmother's hands had made that dress. My grandmother had worn it once and kept it for the rest of her life and told me it was mine. I sat with my hands folded and I breathed. The reception began at 5. The barn was lit with candles and string lights. There was a band playing standards, badly but enthusiastically. Dinner was served. I ate. I had a glass of wine. Patricia sat next to me and did not say a word about any of it because Patricia is from the same place I am from and knows when words are beside the point. The photographer was making rounds. He was photographing the wedding party, the tables, Bryn and Todd at the head table. He was photographing my mother, who was glowing. He was photographing the dress because it was stunning and clearly significant, and I heard my mother explain it to someone, a friend of Gerald's, I think, saying that the dress had been in the family for over 60 years and had been passed down through the women. That was the moment. Not because I planned it to the minute exactly, but because something settled into place that I can only describe as finished. The word that had been waiting to happen for 15 years. I stood up. I walked across the reception hall to where Bryn was standing with two of her bridesmaids near the edge of the dance floor. The photographer was a few feet away. My mother was behind me somewhere. I said, "Bryn, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need to show you something about the dress." Bryn looked at me with the expression of someone who has never fully trusted me, but has always been too comfortable to say so. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The dress has a provenance insert in the lining. It's been there for 15 years. I put it there. I need to show it to you and to whoever else wants to see it, because it affects who this dress belongs to." The room did not go quiet. Most people hadn't heard, but the small group nearest us had, and Bryn's maid of honor, a woman named Cassidy, said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Can you turn slightly? I need access to the interior hem of the train." Bryn did not move immediately. She looked over my shoulder, and I knew without looking that she was looking at my mother. I heard my mother's voice begin from somewhere behind me, saying my name in a tone that was meant to redirect. I did not redirect. I had the embroidery scissors and the seam ripper out of my bag. I put on the cotton gloves. Bryn said, "Nora, this is," and didn't finish the sentence. I crouched down and I found the interior hem of the chapel train, and I found the 3 stitches, which were exactly where I had put them 15 years ago, because some things, made with care and with patience, simply hold. I opened the seam. I removed the small folded piece of acid-free tissue. I stood up. The photographer was very close now, which I had not planned but did not mind. I unfolded the tissue on the table nearest me. Inside was the piece of original silk lining, still intact. Inside was my note, dated August 14th, 15 years prior, and inside was the photocopy of Ruth's letter, in Ruth's handwriting, which said clearly and without ambiguity that the dress was to go to her granddaughter Nora Jean Calloway. I placed Gretchen's documentation packet on the table beside it. Then I looked at my mother. She was standing 8 feet away, in her burgundy dress, with her hair done, and her face had done something I had never seen it do before. It had run out of arrangements. There was no expression she could settle on, because none of them would work. I said, "Ruth told me this dress was mine. She told Patricia. She told Helen Szymanski. She put it in writing, and I put that writing inside this dress 15 years ago, because I knew this day was coming." I kept my voice level. Not cold exactly, just even, the way water is even. "You told me it was lost," I said. "It was not lost." My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Bryn was very still. I want to be honest again. She looked stricken, not guilty, not calculating, genuinely stricken, in the way someone looks when they have been used by someone they trusted and are only right now understanding it. She looked at my mother and she said, very quietly, "You said it was a family piece that Ruth would have wanted me to have." My mother said, Ruth would have wanted. "Ruth left it to me," I said, "in writing, in her own handwriting, which has been inside this dress for 15 years. Gerald, who had been standing near the bar and who had contributed to this situation primarily by doing nothing to prevent it for 20 years, walked over with the specific energy of a man trying to manage a situation he caused. He put his hand on my mother's arm. He said, "Let's not do this here. We can talk about this." Patricia said, from her chair 8 feet away, without getting up, without raising her voice, "Gerald, the documents have already been filed with the magistrate's office in Crawford County, this week, before the wedding." That stopped him. Here is what I will say about Todd, Bryn's husband, on his wedding day. He looked at the documentation on the table, looked at his new wife, looked at my mother, and then looked at me, and said, "Is all of this real?" And when I said it was, he said nothing else. He sat down. I will give him that. He sat down and let what was real be real. The maid of honor, Cassidy, was the one who actually started crying, which none of us had anticipated, and which broke the particular controlled tension of the moment in a way that sent the evening sideways into something more genuinely human. Someone from the wedding party went to get water. The photographer had stopped shooting, then started again, then stopped, and I could see him making the decision in real time about what his job required. My mother apologized. Not immediately, not cleanly, not without a significant amount of preamble and repositioning, but ultimately in front of her husband and her stepdaughter's new husband and 2 tables of extended family who had drifted over to see what was happening. She said the words. She said she had made a decision she should not have made. She said the dress should have gone to Nora. It was not a beautiful apology. It was the kind of apology that comes out when all the other options have been exhausted. But it was public, and it was said in front of people who would remember it, in a room where a photographer had been working all evening. Bryn changed out of the dress before the dancing started. She borrowed a white wrap from one of her bridesmaids, and she wore that for the rest of the night. I watched her on the dance floor with Todd later, in the borrowed wrap, and she was laughing at something he said, and she looked lighter than she had in the dress, though I recognize that might be something I'm only able to believe because I needed to. The dress came to me in an archival box the following week, delivered by my mother via my Aunt Carol, who did not say a word when she handed it over, just pressed my hand once and nodded. I laid it on my bed that evening and I looked at it for a long time. The seed pearls, the charmeuse, the shoulder seam where Ruth had made the invisible repair in 1978, the 3 stitches in the interior hem that I had placed at 22 and that had held, exactly as I'd intended, for 15 years. I put on the cotton gloves and I refolded it in fresh tissue paper. Cedar blocks, archival box. It is in my closet now, in my apartment in Butler County. Whether I ever wear it is a question I haven't answered yet. What I know is that it is mine. That was always the only part that mattered. In the civil matter, Gretchen filed the formal documentation with the county court the following month, establishing my ownership of the dress based on written attestation of intent, witness testimony, and the provenance materials recovered from the interior hem. My mother did not contest it. There was nothing to contest. The documentation was clear and had been clear for 15 years. The case was resolved without trial. It cost me less than I expected, financially. It cost me more in other ways that I am still accounting for. My mother and I do not speak the way we used to. We speak occasionally, the way people speak when they are related and cannot entirely close the distance, but also cannot pretend it isn't there. She has never acknowledged, in any of our conversations since, that she planned what she did. She has framed it to herself as a misunderstanding, I think, or as a decision made in good faith that went wrong. I don't know what she tells herself. I know what happened. Patricia and I drove back to Butler County the night of the wedding, and we stopped at the same gas station outside Mercer, where we'd stopped on the way up. I got the same coffee, same size. Patricia got a bag of chips and ate them in the passenger seat without saying anything for 20 miles, and then she said, "Ruth would have loved that." I said, "I know." She said, "The part with the seam ripper especially." I said, "She taught me to sew." Patricia laughed. It was the kind of laugh that has some crying in it, but that's all right. That is what most honest things have in them. I want to say something about what I learned, though I want to be careful about how I say it, because I did not come out of this believing I had won something grand. What I came out of this believing is narrower than that, and more durable. Document everything. I know that sounds transactional for a story about a grandmother's dress and rose water and cedar and a sewing room on Morrow Creek Road, but it is the truest thing I can offer. The paper I placed inside that dress was the only thing that stood between my grandmother's intention and my mother's revision of it. Not my word, not my grief, not the clear moral weight of the situation, which was obvious to anyone who examined it. The paper. Document everything, always, before you need to. The people who smile the warmest at you can be the same people planning to simply remove you from an inheritance and replace you with someone more convenient. That is not cynicism. That is information. Hold it. And the third thing, which I think is the most important, the impulse to stay quiet, to not make a scene, to let things be because the disruption costs too much. That impulse, when it comes from a place of dignity rather than fear, can be the most powerful thing in the room. I waited. I sat in the 3rd row during the ceremony, and I breathed and I waited. And when I stood up, I did not raise my voice, and the quiet of it was the thing that made it real in that room. Loud does not mean true. The women I come from, and I include Ruth Elaine Marsh first among them, knew how to hold something until exactly the right moment and then set it down. That is not passivity. That is precision. I think about my grandmother's hands sometimes, the rose water and cedar, the way she'd fold the tissue paper back over that dress with the same care every single August, like the dress was still going somewhere, like it still had something to do. It did. It just took 15 years to get there. Here is what I want to ask you. Have you ever known, really known, in the deep, quiet part of yourself, that something was being taken from you and made the decision to wait and prepare instead of reacting immediately? Have you ever been the person in that room with the evidence already in their coat pocket, already filed with the court, already 15 years in the making? And if you haven't, would you? I think about that question a lot. I think about what it costs to be that patient. I think about what it costs not to be. If this story hit you somewhere real, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the person who needs to hear it. I'll see you soon.